Well, my guest today is the journalist, music journalist, and biographer Bob Spitz, whose new book is a doorstop on the Rolling Stones. And despite my recent heart procedure, as soon as this book was pitched to me as a topic for a show, I said, well, I definitely have to have a look since I've been on the Rolling Stones bandwagon for since about 1983.
Yeah.
Considering they're a band that's been around for 60 years, yeah, I haven't been there for the first third, but I've been a fan for a while. Bob, congratulations on this staggering book.
Thanks so much. Staggering. Uh-oh. We're in
Staggering.
trouble.
Partly because as a writer, I imagined trying to write this, and I pictured your house as being one of those like investigative crime scenes with like just walls covered with notes because there's so much history to cover.
Yes, it's like Carrie in Homeland, with her crazy walls. That's me.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing the biography and deciding how, because it's a big book, but I imagine an easy danger would be, well, okay, it probably could have been twice the size. So can you talk a little bit about the research process, figuring out what you were going to cover and what depth you were going to cover it, and a lot of those decisions, because there's so much lore to get into. And I do want to talk about that, but I want to make sure that we talk about the nuts and bolts of the writing as well.
Well, even before we talk about the Stones, let me give you a little danger story about putting together the Beatles biography. It was almost 20 years ago when I had complete access to the band, the people who were still around, and everybody who was connected with them. And I had 55,000 pages of research. When I turned in the manuscript, which was supposed to take 3 years, but 8.5 years later, I put the manuscript on my publisher's desk, and it was 2,800 pages long. And he looked at it and he said, "Bob, this is unpublishable." Uh, and so um, they cut 1,700 pages out of the book. A seamless cut. We didn't rewrite a single word. And I brought it in at a sleek 964 pages. The Stones was a little less. The Stones, I used some discipline. It's like a novella. It's only 704 pages. But the process, first of all, it told me the Beatles really taught me how to edit. I'll never do that again. Having 55,000 pages of research was, I guess, ridiculous. I wanted to capture the story. I did. We let three-quarters of the story go. But with the Stones, I was more disciplined. And it's a process of while you're working to discipline yourself and think what's important, what the readers want to read, how to stack up the information and report it properly, and at the same time to make sure that nobody's been misquoted, that the facts are all right, that it's a complex story, and that I get it right. There are a couple errors in the book we've caught since publication. That happens every time. But yeah, John, it's all part of a process, and this is now my 11th book, my 11th biography, and I've got a system, and it's working for me.
And what is the system? Like
Um,
you, when people suggest, oh, you should make a video about this, or you should write that, my
yeah,
brain instantly goes into damage control mode. Like, how much will this fuck up my life if I actually follow this person's advice? And it sounds like
yeah,
that's what the Beatles book taught you in part was how can I minimize the damage I'm going to do to myself in
exactly.
trying to
Yeah.
attack this project? But tell me more about the process.
It's 2 years of research, 2 years of writing, and the research begins. It's a collection process. I collect everything that's ever been written about my subject, and I store it in a series of binders. There were 10 binders for the Rolling Stones project, and I I title them by articles that have been written about them, their music, album reviews, and then the interviews that I've conducted. And usually I try to conduct 150 to 200 interviews with all my subjects for the book. I print them all out. I need to see them. I need to have written things in the margin to remind me where something will go and how truthful it is that they've told me, because that's a whole different story, the investigation process. And then I begin to write, and it's even more complicated storing everything in these binders because my wife, who is a narrative nonfiction author, works right behind me. We work back to back, and so our shelves are jammed with. I work from binders, she works from folders, whole different beast. And it's fascinating. I know where everything is. When I had the 55,000 pages of research for the Beatles, if you had asked me where a certain article is, I could put my hands right on it. I make a roadmap uh, in a document, in a Word document, of where everything is so that I can put my hands on it right away. And it's become a seamless process. I think I've gotten it down. The Stones took only 2 years to write. I could have written it faster, probably. The next one will be faster. Each one gets a little faster, and I'm nearing the finish line. Yeah, I seem to have the process down now, and I'm enjoying myself. I've always enjoyed writing, but now I'm enjoying writing more because uh, it's worked out that I know where everything is.
The old school binder method, which is to say, all right, so it's on paper, you've read. I imagine that there's some mojo in that.
Oh, there is. Yeah, no, I am. It's funny. I used to be a manager of rock and roll artists. I managed Bruce Springsteen, and for a while I managed Elton John. And I remember watching Nigel Olsson, the drummer. He had his drums in a circle all around him, and he sat on a swivel chair, and he would swivel around and play the drums. I'm Nigel Olsson when it comes to research. I lay my binders out that I need for the day all around me, and I swivel and I grab them and I pull them and I write for them. My wife's not real happy with the process, but we've got a sort of detente in our office, so it's working out.
Well, thank goodness she uses folders instead of binders because,
Absolutely. Who understands somebody who does something like that? Not me.
well, at a glance, though, okay, this is my research, that's her research,
Hmm.
so that there's not going to be any misunderstandings, hopefully.
The only misunderstanding we have is that I sometimes talk to my computer screen, and that's a no-no in our office. I've had to break myself of that habit.
Hopefully, you're a good husband, maybe not the greatest roommate or
Right.
office
Exactly
mate.
right. Yeah.
I first learned who the Rolling Stones were, really. I mean, I assume I saw Start Me Up on MTV in 1982 or 83. And I remember seeing the giant standee display for the Hal Ashbury film, Let's Spend the Night Together, at the movie
Right.
theater, and not knowing who the Rolling Stones were. In typical Stones fashion, okay, no, it's not a movie poster for a comic. No, it's this 10-foot giant spectacle in the lobby of a movie theater. And
Hmm.
I didn't know who they were. I didn't go to the movies to see the Rolling Stones, but when it played later on HBO, I remember being blown away by the spectacle, liking the music. It's a bit of a loose show. It's not the tightest Stones performance. A lot of the time, they seem to be having a lot of fun. You do see, I think, probably prime Mick Jagger.
Hmm.
But when they got to Time Is on My Side and they start doing the retrospective, like they layer in all of this older Stones imagery and then some kind of crazy historical footage that has nothing to do with the Stones other than this is what was happening in the world as they were becoming a band. That's when it occurred to me, oh, this is a band with a history. Because, I don't know, I would have been 12. The idea of music history, like, it's all just happening.
Actually, there's an even better movie that I can refer you to, and it was filmed by Martin Scorsese. And that is a Rolling Stones concert from beginning to end. And it's the most exciting rock and roll movie that I have ever seen. I've just recently watched it again. And it's amazing. It's a spectacle, as you called it. And their shows are spectacles. They remain to this day. I saw them at SoFi Stadium in California last year. I was sitting about halfway back, a couple blocks away, and there was a proscenium from the stage. I swear, John, that it was 2 city blocks long, and Mick Jagger danced back and forth on that proscenium all night, and I had to jab my wife in the ribs and say, "You're looking at an 82-year-old man." Modern science right there. Quite a spectacle. The Stones have always prided themselves on spectacle, whether it's their age, whether it's they're still alive, whether it's their remarkable ways of presenting their concerts, and even in their songwriting and their albums. Spectacle has always been at the forefront of the Rolling Stones, and they've managed to keep that sharp throughout a 65-year career. Amazed me writing this book to watch it in progress and to see how it sustained itself over 65 years. I was really quite surprised at their ability to keep it that sharp. But I've been with rock and rollers who are that age and have really called it a day long before.
I can totally attest. No, they're a sharper band in the 21st century than in the 20th century.
I think so. I think you're right.
Part of that has to do with probably cleaning up, getting along better, which isn't nothing.
Well, that's been the whole secret to the Rolling Stones' longevity. As long as Mick and Keith have to talk to themselves for this enterprise to stay sharp and bright. And as you mentioned, it hasn't always gone that way. One of the things that they're lucky about is that they have a kind of professional and respect for each other that's as strong as their personal respect. And that is their tasks are completely different. Mick is the libidinous peacock, the showman. Keith is the consummate riff master, and they don't compete. They have 2 different tasks. Keith is happy to let Mick be the front man, and that's always been part of the success of the Rolling Stones. It's the one thing that the Beatles and John and Paul never learned. They were always arguing with each other, always competing to see who was going to be the front person. And the other thing is, the Beatles in 1966 stopped performing. And so they stopped connecting with their audience. And that's one thing that the Stones have maintained. And they've done it consciously to connect with their audience, to always either be recording, making new music, or performing. And that's the way the bad boys stay out of trouble. When they're off the road, there was a stretch, as you kind of alluded to, where Mick and Keith were not talking to each other, and it looked like that was the end of the Rolling Stones. Keith was referring to Mick in the press as Her Majesty, or he called him Brenda because he had passed a bookstore once and saw a novel by a woman named Brenda Jagger. So Mick became Brenda to him. And they slagged each other off in the press. But even when they weren't talking, even when it looked like things were rent asunder, Keith got married at the age of 40 in the midst of all this. And who does he have as his stand-up best man? Mick Jagger. I mean, go figure. I don't know how these guys do it.
I wonder right when Keith will call Mick Her Majesty, what effect being British might have on that? Because I know some Brits can be totally acerbic. I think of Martin Amis, who I once got to interview, and publicly he could just be so acidic. And one-on-one, he was such a doting, kind gentleman who really wanted me to get what I needed to get out of our interview. And so I'm wondering, when they're that mean to each other.
That's Keith Richards in a nutshell, just the way you described Martin Amis. Keith can be the sweetest guy in the world, but he has an incredibly sharp tongue. And even more than that, he has a hair trigger temper. So he might at any time, what he says routinely is to show you the blade. And you might see that blade come out, and you better run. Um,
And it's an actual blade.
Oh, it's an actual blade.
Yes.
Take my word for it. Yeah. And a lot of people have seen it and have had it flung at them. Not directly at them, but close enough so that Keith makes his point. And yet, on the other hand, he is, I'll give you a good example, the most romantic guy in the world. One day, all the Stones were sitting around talking. This was in the mid-90s. And they were talking about all the women that they had slept with, and they were tallying them up. And Bill Wyman had stopped counting at about 1,800. And he had the names and addresses of every woman that he had slept with. He made sure he tallied them up. Mick finished at around 900, and Keith tallied 4 on one hand. He's a romantic. Keith's a romantic, yet he's acerbic, and they do fling around words at each other. It's all part of the Rolling Stones legacy. It's who they are.
They're a band of paradoxes, which might have something to do with their appeal and their longevity. They've survived so many trends. At some point in the 90s, it seemed like they calmed down and they're like, all right, we're a rock band. And they were done with trends because everything new they made could just sound classic if they just made rock and roll. But, on one side, they are the most glossy, pampered, most public, most, the creators of this giant spectacle.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they're this dangerous, rebellious bar band who nobody should let near, the locals because they are feral. And
they'd love to hear that, by the way.
Yeah. And I'm passionate about music. And there are certain artists who people could say, oh, I love this musician. And I try not to be a public pain in the ass. So I will just keep my severe judgment to myself. But I will think I can't really connect with you if that is your ideal. There are plenty of artists who I'm like, that's not for me, but that's fine. There are other artists where I'm like, oh no, there's something wrong with you if you like that.
Yeah.
Anyone who's ever told me, oh, I don't like the Rolling Stones at all, I'm like, then you don't like rock and roll. You can't like rock and roll. Right. If you dislike the Stones. And I think it's because, they're too glossy. It's like, keep listening. Like it's gonna get weird. It's gonna get wild. And if you think they're too wild, and it's like, okay, they've got so much groove, like you could dance to so much of their music.
That's right.
I dare you to experience it and not engage and connect with it.
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting thing too. You can't dance to any of the Beatles music. When you think about it, when you go over all those songs, you could probably slow dance to Yesterday, but that's about it. You're right. You can dance to every one of the Stones songs. And we also have to take this into consideration. The Rolling Stones defined the sound of rock and roll because up until they came along, we had doo-wop, we had R&B, we had rockabilly. And the Beatles, even to some extent, were pop when they first entered the scene. But the Rolling Stones kind of amalgamated all of it, and they hot wired it, and they attached jumper cables to it, and they created the sound that we now know today as rock and roll. And they have they have, as you mentioned before, ventured into other areas. Look, they did Miss You in the disco song, and they've done reggae, they've done country and western, but they always come back to the sound that they established back in the mid 60s with Satisfaction, with 19th Nervous Breakdown, with Gimme Shelter and Bitch and all those fabulous songs that they gave us. And that's the sound of rock and roll. And when they are announced as the greatest rock and roll band in the world, I used to take issue with that, but not so much anymore. Here they are giving it to us in 2026. I mean, more than a half century of pumping out that rock and roll music. The Stones are the bedrock of it all. I think that everybody who came after took a little bit from them and added, a hunk of hair and a little bone to it in their own way. But it's basically the Stones version of rock and roll.
For me as a Stones fan, kind of a, I don't know, lifelong Stones fan. I mean, not from the womb, but since 12, I've been a fan. The the great gift of your book is establishing the cultural context in which the Rolling
Hmm.
Stones formed the crazy musical passions that seemed so exotic and outlandish for England in the early 60s,
Yeah,
and how obsessed they were with the blues and how mystifying that was to everyone in the music establishment until it wasn't.
right.
So to me, that those were the most illuminating chapters. A lot of it for me was a travelogue, like, oh, I remember that. And I was learning, I mean, I was gaining insight through the whole book,
Hmm.
but you really opened up a portal into an England I couldn't imagine in the Stones' early days. So I presume you weren't there at the time. So can you talk about working on that part of the
Sure.
book?
I learned a lot of this too when I worked on the Beatles book because the cultural context was really the most important thing. If you don't establish that early on, whoops, then you've really missed the boat for your reader. You have to let them know exactly where they are and how they got there. And so when was in Liverpool for a long time, I learned how the blues came to the UK. And it was basically for two reasons. Number one, after World War II, the GIs who were stationed in the UK left all their 45s and 78s behind. They didn't take them home with them. And these kids recovered them, and they were like discovering King Tut's tomb.
Yeah.
There it was. The key to the universe was right there in their hands. And what the GIs listened to were Delta and Chicago blues and country and Western music. That was it. And so the kids in the UK got that. We never got it here in the States. It eluded the kids here. And that's because none of the R&B stations uh, had enough voltage to play to a big audience, and also because of the discrimination. Black acts could not find places to play where white people could see them in the United States. Not so in the UK. They were embraced there. So many of the great artists here, like BB King and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Sonny Boy Williamson, even Little Richard and Chuck Berry had fabulous careers in the UK because they got gigs over there where large audiences and mixed audiences could come see them perform. And so the Stones very early on decided that this blues was for them. It was Brian Jones who brought it to everybody's attention. He was a blues aficionado, and Mick and Keith soon got the religion. And so their gods were Jimmy Reed and you know Sonny Boy and Son House and all these fabulous artists. And then they found a way to make it a little more contemporary by listening to Chuck Berry, who electrified it with a kind of a rock and roll beat. And as I said before, the Stones hotwired it. They gave it the ultimate, and you can see the progression of music go from real Delta blues to R&B to rockabilly to Rolling Stones rock and roll. It's right there. And in the book, I wanted to make sure you can see that thread so clearly that you know where you've come from and you know where you're going.
Also establishing how stagnant pop music was in England at the time.
It was horrible. It was, yeah, it was, it was a bunch of young faces who took our worst rock and roll records and made them worser. That's exactly, they just covered, like Pat Boone, they covered everything that was going on in the States with terrible accompaniment and not much talent. And yeah, I felt sorry for those kids over there. And it wasn't until the next generation got their hands on the controls, the post-war kids, like Mick and Keith, like John and Paul, like the Kinks, like the Animals, that we got a release of music that spun things in a different direction and really ushered in what we now know as the 60s rock and roll scene.
For English teenagers, my gut would have told me, okay, I don't trust them to play country music. I don't trust them to play blues.
Mm.
And the way I see it, I think there was like kind of two progressions. First, okay, it's their rock and roll version of these things. And what happened over years is, okay, it became a Rolling Stones version of those things. And if I play the right Stones next to Muddy Waters, I don't think, okay, now here's white blues and now here's real blues. I think it's all blues. That probably wasn't true at the earliest stages.
It's true. The Stones were feeling their way around. I mean, when they played their early shows at the Crawdaddy, they were club, they were only doing blues. And they were doing them authentically. Uh, of course, authentically to a point, you got Mick Jagger, mincing about the stage,
Yeah.
which the Stones, which the blues players would never have done. But there's a scene in the book, and it's one of my favorite scenes, where these young boys, Mick and Keith and Brian, and 4 or 5 of their friends take a 5-hour drive and they go to Manchester to see their idols. And it's called I think it was called the American Rock Blues Festival. And this was the first time they were ever going to see these guys live. And they did. All the great blues artists were there, the real authentic blues artists. And sitting in one row in the sixth row of this theater was Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck. And they were all 18 to 20 years old. And they sat there with their mouths open. I talked to so many people who had joined them and really could tell me exactly what was going on. Their mouths like hit their knees. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And they absorbed it. They absorbed it and they took it back. And on that ride back to they left at midnight because Keith had a post office job delivering the mail, and they had to get him back to London. And it was a 5.5, 6 hour trip. They drove back all night, and what did they do? They sang all the way back and harmonized. And this is the fever that these kids had. I mean, it was a fever. They had contracted it, and they didn't know how to. They had no drugs to yet yet
Yeah.
to put it out. And it was the music that they were drunk on, and it was fabulous. Yeah.
Well, in the 90s, very early 90s, when they were touring on steel wheels,
Hmm.
they broadcast a concert, and I was on the fence about the value of the album Steel Wheels
Hmm.
and the current state of the Stones. I guess perpetual bitching and moaning from fans is part of the territory for the Rolling Stones. But they brought on John Lee Hooker as a guest star.
Hmm.
And at one point, John Lee Hooker is way in front of the stage and he's dancing, and everyone is holding back. No one's willing to steal any of the spotlight away from John Lee Hooker. And I remember
Right.
thinking, I love these fucking guys.
Well, Hooker was on that show in Manchester that they saw, and they were paying back all through
Yeah.
their career. On this last tour, they brought out Irma Thomas, they brought out Buddy Guy, they brought out Betty LaVette, all people who were in their late 80s, some in their 90s, to give them a regard, to give them a send off, to honor them, to sing. And yeah, I mean, the Stones have never forgotten where they've come from. And that's the music they listen to. They still listen to R&B. I've gone into Keith's house, his apartment when he lived near me in the Village here in New York, and that's all the music that he's playing in his house. He's got a big picture of BB King on his mantelpiece. He's got Robert Johnson in another room. Um, they've never forgotten it. They play the blues, and they love the blues. And Brian Jones left. He pulled away from the Stones because he thought they were becoming too rock and roll. That they weren't honoring their roots where they had come from. Ian Stewart, who was the sixth Rolling Stone, wouldn't play any song that had a minor chord in it because he called them Chinese chords because he felt it wasn't true to boogie woogie and rhythm and blues. And so, these guys, I mean, they're a little wacky, but they had their standards.
When people ask me what is your favorite Stones album, it's a litmus
Mm.
test for how my day is going. If my
Okay.
if my
Well,
head
let's hear it. Let's hear it,
if my
John.
head is screwed on right, then I'm like Exile on Main Street, obviously. Which I don't know that
Oof.
it has to be obviously, but it's a strong,
Yeah.
like it's hard to just dismiss that as their best album. If I'm in a testy mood, then I'll say, "Oh, Talk Is Cheap" is their greatest
Well,
album.
that is testy. Yeah.
It's a great album, and I will put it next to any Stones album and fight to the death over it, but
Mm.
not a Stones record.
As close to a Stones, not a Stones record that you're going to get.
Steel Wheels, I know it had one song that didn't make it onto Talk Is Cheap on there, and
Mm.
so it sounded, you could feel some of Talk Is Cheap going into Steel Wheels.
I stand with Mick Jagger on this one. Um, Exile on Main Street and Here Comes the Heresy, my friend, is one of my least favorite Rolling Stones albums. I think it's a mess. I think it's sloppy. They made it sloppily. Mick wasn't around for most of it. Too many country and western songs on it. There, I hear too much heroin in it when I listen to it, and I guess I'm prejudiced. I love the hits, and so for me, it's Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers. That's where the hits are. If you're an esoteric Stones fan, I guess Exile must be the album. Mick does not like Exile. He doesn't do songs from it very often. Um, but that's what makes horse races, pal. That's why we're here.
Well, here's the thing. If I were going to argue with you about this, I would just
Yeah.
start by granting all of your points about Exile on Main Street.
Hmm.
Like,
Okay.
like,
Well,
like,
there you go.
I don't think we're seeing it differently. I think we just feel differently about the results. But no, yes to everything you said about Exile on Main Street.
I will tell you that there's a real interesting aside in the book that I think really helps to define what we're talking about, and that is Lester Bangs, who was one of the great rock and roll critics at one point, listened to Exile on Main Street and despised it. And then 2 weeks later, he put it on his turntable and listened to it 3 or 4 times much more carefully and described it as the best rock and roll album he'd ever heard in his life. So, I think that you have to listen to Exile very carefully. It's a complicated album. And yes, it is a mess. And yes, there are some great rock and roll, great Rolling Stones songs on that. But I think it's a complicated album for most listeners. Should have been a single album.
Partly for someone who's worried about the Rolling Stones getting too slick, it's like, okay, you
Mm,
can always just pull out Exile on Main Street and go, they're not
okay,
too slick. Like that is
fair enough. Fair
evidence
enough.
for all time. This
That's
was
true.
this was their best effort that year.
They made it under such fascinating conditions. Look, they were in exile in France. Mick had just gotten married. He wasn't around for most of the sessions because Bianca wanted to give birth in Paris, and so Mick was flying back and forth. The house that they recorded in, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book, is a mansion that Keith had rented called Villa Nelcott, this great big splendorous estate on the water in Villefranche, and everybody was living there. The band, the drug dealers, the cooks and their kids, the people who were robbing them blind, anybody who came in to visit. It was like a huge commune, and they recorded down in the basement. But the basement was so narrow and so old and so had no conditions for recording that no musician could be in the same room with any other musician. So they couldn't see where uh, where their cohorts were playing. They couldn't follow them. They had to hear them with headphones. It was 150 degrees down there. It was the hottest summer of the in 100 years. They had to wear bathing suits. They drank tons of beer. They couldn't get the heat to stop going in this old mansion. And that's where they made Exile on Main Street. So, the Stones can record anywhere. And that chapter of the book just shows you how adept they are to their surroundings, their environment.
You report on that wonderfully in the book. Yeah, just uh, the chaos, uh,
Yeah, yeah.
which seems like it plagued almost every Stones album, but that one probably more than any of the others.
Well, Keith was out of control. Surprisingly, throughout most of the book, even when Keith is on drugs, he's shockingly in control. But he was out of control, and so was Anita, his common law wife, and the people who came to visit brought them, you know, quantities of drugs to make him even more out of control, and so. And the drug dealers were living at the gates, and the chef was a drug dealer, one of them, and I mean, it was like a chaotic circus in that house. But that's rock and roll. And if you need more of a definition of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's in that chapter that takes place in Villa Nelcott where we get Exile on Main Street.
I am extremely fond of Let It Bleed. I had that LP and wore it out by the end of the 1980s. We don't share our favorite album, but
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of hits on that album, a lot of classic Rolling Stones hits, and Brian Jones was still around and still contributing to a certain extent. And so that was the core band. You really heard them there. And I think that Mick and Keith had learned how to produce. They knew their way. It was just like what I was explaining to you with me when I was my process for writing. It took me It took me a couple of books to get it straight. Well, it took Mick and Keith 4 or 5 albums until they learned their way around the studio. But by the time that we get to Let It Bleed and Beggar's Banquet, they are in full command. And even Jimmy Miller, who was producing those albums, relied on Mick and Keith to come in the control room to make sure everything was in order. And they, again, we'll go back to our initial conversation, editing. They learned how to edit their own music. They were really sharp when it came to knowing which versions of the songs were the best, how to get them on record, who to bring in to augment those recordings. And so that's why and they're still young enough and not fucked up enough to produce single, concise, great albums. And there you have it. Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed right there.
So to prepare for this interview, I've been, yeah, watching a lot of live Stones concerts.
Yeah.
I've cried more than once seeing Charlie Watts,
Ah, yes. A
and
remarkable band member. Yeah.
he might be my favorite Stone, which is saying a lot because I do love them, especially when they seem to be having fun on stage, and I'm like, good, like you should be having fun.
That beat was infallible. Charlie couldn't be rocked off that beat. He didn't participate in the chaos at that point. So he's got it all together, and he is as disciplined a drummer as you're ever going to see. Can't be shaken. When you see girls ripping the clothes off Mick and Keith and Brian, Charlie is continuing to play. He's got the beat going. Yeah, they're pulling girls off the stage. Charlie doesn't even see it. And he was disciplined throughout his entire life. I mean, it was really fascinating to watch the progression of his life. It is as steady as his drumming. He was a one woman man, excuse me, throughout his entire career. As you know, he was a fashion crazed man. He dressed impeccably. There's a great scene in the book when later on, when Mick comes back from a dinner with Keith late one night, they're in Amsterdam,
Mhm.
and he calls Charlie up. It's about 2 in the morning, and he calls Charlie's room and he goes, "Charlie Watts, where's my drummer?" And Keith says, "Mick, I don't think you should have done that." So what does Charlie do? Charlie very casually gets up. Now remember, it's 2 o'clock. He puts on his best bespoke Savile Row suit, handkerchief in the breast pocket, tie perfectly knotted in place. His shoes are shined. He even puts on a little cologne, and he goes downstairs and he knocks on Mick's hotel room door, and Mick answers it. And Charlie, dressed gorgeously, grabs Mick by the collar of his shirt, says, "Don't ever call me your drummer," and punches Mick right in the face. That's Charlie Watts in a nutshell.
That's him losing
Also,
control.
never loses that. Charlie
No,
never lost control.
no,
Yeah,
that's what it looks like when he loses control is he wears a
exactly
suit,
right.
he deliberately gives one punch and leaves.
That's right. But Charlie's also complicated in other ways. What does he do every night when the guys are scoring groupies and drinking and taking drugs? Charlie goes back to his hotel room because Charlie trained as an artist, um, a graphic artist, and he goes back to his hotel room every single night they've been on tour for the entire Stones career. And what does he do? He draws his hotel room to scale. It takes him the rest of the evening till he goes to bed. That's what he does. Um, Charlie also was one of the greatest collectors of antique cars. He had an antique car collection that would make Jay Leno's salivate. Charlie couldn't drive, a single one of those cars. He didn't have a driver's license. He never learned how to drive. But he would sit behind the wheel and he would just run his hand over the steering wheel and just sit there and look at his cars. That's John is Charlie Watts in a nutshell. A very unusual guy. And hard not to love. I mean, for who he was. He, never cracked a smile. He was not a great interview. I interviewed him in the mid 90s, and he gave me a very good interview, some of which appeared in the book because he had passed away before I started writing. But really a complicated man, but a great drummer, much like Ringo Starr. Very straightforward, very straight ahead. Not flashy. Never played a drum solo in his life. Just like Ringo. Yeah.
You close the book with a description of that concert you went to.
Mm-hmm.
Was it last year or the year before?
2024. Yeah.
It's such a beautiful moving coda to this book.
Thank you. Mm.
And it does that great do not go gently into this good night move,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's a turn. You're our nondescript biographer until the last chapter when you're like,
Yeah.
all right, now it's me going to the show.
I have to say, it's funny that you even bring that up because I just this morning got off the phone with my friend Jonathan Eig, who won the Pulitzer Prize last year for the Martin Luther King Jr. Biography. And he's writing George Soros's biography present. And he sent me his opening chapter. And I said, wait a second, there's only one thing wrong with it. You're a part of it. and that's what we're talking about right here. I said, he said, but you did that. And I said, yes, but I did it at the end of the book. You make yourself a character at the beginning of this, and you can't disappear then.
Yeah.
You have to be a character throughout the rest of the story. And so he's now going back to rewrite that because I thought long and hard about that. It was one of my biggest problems with other people who had written about the Stones. They always want to project themselves into the story. There are any number of Rolling Stones books. There are pictures of the author with their arms around Keith at a concert, a photograph taken, or I did not want to be anywhere in that book. I wanted to be the omniscient author telling you the story. Until the very end, I thought, you know what? Now I have a right to step in and to tell you how to sum this up for you. And the only way I could do that was to tell you about the concert through my eyes. And I'm not really a character in that, but it's me writing at that concert. And I found that concert to be fascinating because there were 4 generations of fans coming to see these guys, many of them not born anywhere near the Keystones output, and and some who had no idea who they were coming to see because their grandparents brought them. Their grandparents who come in on walkers. It fascinated me. It really did. I didn't know how to end this book. I got to the beginning of the 90s, and my wife said to me, my wife is the real writer in the family. She said to me, you're going to end it in the next chapter. And I said, no, I can't do that. I mean, we're talking about another 40 years. She said, Bob, they have stopped making the music of the moment. They are now just making good rock and roll music. But you're going to take us over their same tours again and again, the same old backstage, the same old in the studio. It's not their most important music. Sum it up. And I said, no way I can do that. And she said to me, you sit here for a couple of days. You sit and think real hard, and then you come talk to me. And I sat down and I wrote that last chapter. It's the chapter that comes before the epilogue that we talked about. And I covered the last 30 years of the Stones, I think. And I think that was the way to end. My wife was right. That was I'm I'm hearing from readers who just want another volume, but so be it. They're not going to see that. And I think that was the way to do it.
I'm of two minds about that.
I'm sure you would
So,
be.
on the other hand, I do have to confess, just holding this book in my hands, it feels heavy enough. So,
Yeah,
if it were significantly heavier, it might actually impact my ability to read the pages just out of sheer weight.
you'd
So
have to go to the audiobook.
part of I would have loved more detail on that. And on the other hand, I also realized, okay, yeah, this book is already huge.
I think it told you who the Stones were and how they operate and how they lived and how they made their music at the most crucial time in their career. Um, and they continued to make great music, but perhaps not the most crucial. Um, they went on tour almost by rote. There was no great backstage scenes after that. They were elderly statesmen. Um, yeah, is that the Rolling Stones anymore? I don't know. I mean, yes, it is to one extent, and to another extent, it's not the Rolling Stones that I wanted to give you.
What that chapter does is helps us wrap up their lives so far. So it became less about the music and okay, here's what happened with the personnel and here's what happened health wise and
Yeah, right.
saying goodbye to Charlie, was moving and learning about that. And as a creative writer and as a writer myself, I realized, okay, for every piece, not every good idea can go in. And it
Right.
doesn't harm a book if not every good idea goes in.
So it's how we began this discussion. I mean, self-editing and really thinking of what you're trying to present to your reader and how to do it in the best possible way without boring them, and yet keeping the narrative alive and strong and making sure that your audience is alert and turning the pages rather than just flipping to the end. And so that all takes part in that's part of the process when I write.
That little part of me that was a little disappointed that we didn't go deep into every record and every tour
Yeah, you'll get over
felt, well,
it.
you helped me get over it, Bob, with the
Thank you.
epilogue and
Uh-huh.
the description of that show. And I teared up a little bit at the end.
Yeah, me
So I
too.
felt
Yeah.
like, as a writer, even though we did go into overdrive towards the very end of this pretty big book, I did feel like the last bit of the book was just the perfect ending.
You have to learn how to bring your story to a close. I mean, this is a band that's still performing, so uh, you know you got to bring it. A book has to be brought to an end point, and it took me a long time to think about it, but I finally decided that, and this is the proper way. And readers will disagree, but that's fine. That's what makes horse races, as I said before. It's my way of doing it.